Hey Dave, how are you?
It's great to be here, Ahmed.
Thank you for coming to the show. I'm really excited about this episode because of design thinking and a lot of things. And all episodes, we usually start with a quote, and I'll let you have it.
Robert Frost, the great American poet, once said for the last two lines of one of his poems, "So morning turns to day, nothing gold can stay." And I think that's a really good reminder that everything is transient. We need to live every day with gratitude, and we need to seek every opportunity that we can.
That's an amazing quote for starting this episode. And I'm going to take you to the artistic point of view. House of Commons in England, there was a speech for the first US president, President Barack Obama, to talk about something. And his speech was received with a lot of enthusiasm because it was poetic.
Yes.
As technologist, you have your undergrad is in electric, your master's in mechanic, but I felt when I was at Mach49, you had an artistic view, and it got to do with design thinking and whatnot. But why art, and why poetry, and why or other sciences are important in the technology realm?
I would broaden this beyond a question of art or humanities being important in the technology realm. I think in the 21st century, it's incumbent on all of us to be well-rounded individuals. It's incumbent on all of us. It's too simple to just focus entirely on a narrow craft like being the world's best Python coder or something like that. Ultimately, I think both to get ahead and to maximize job satisfaction, we all need intellectual curiosity, we need tolerance, we need humility, and we need to welcome inspiration in every form, from visual art, from written art, from the works of famous psychologists, from religious studies, as well as from great business thinkers.
I love that. I'm going to start by, before I ask the first question, I'm going to read a paragraph from Mach49, and then we'll come back to you. It says, in the late 90s, Dave played an integral part in the movement that expanded the reach of design thinking, going beyond just physical product design to include the design of services, experiences, and businesses. This shift did not just alter how big organizations disrupt growth, it also laid the groundwork for new disruptive changes in government and academia. Since then, Dave has committed himself to changing how large corporations operate. From Johns Hopkins to Cisco, your career has spanned a lot of corporations in the US and educational institutes, including Stanford and Berkeley. What do you do now? So to give the audience, what do you do now in Mach49? And then we'll start with your background, and then we'll come up to that experience section. But will you want to give the audience who's Dave Blackley and what does he do now?
Sure. Let's talk specifically about the description you just read, and then jump forward to today. So it's the 1990s. Bill Clinton is president. I'm working at this company just about 5 blocks from where we are here in downtown Palo Alto called IDEO. We were a product design and engineering company. We used design thinking to do design work. And it was in the 90s that we discovered that the methods and tools of design, like iterative cycles of fast prototyping, brainstorming, synthesis of user research, user empathy, we discovered that those strategies could be elevated and reapplied in areas that had nothing to do with design. We discovered that design thinking, not design itself, not the creation of physical products or the creation of on-screen experiences, but design thinking could be applied to improve government agencies or to do a better job in financial services. All right? Jump forward to today. That was, I should say, an amazingly exciting ride. I feel at Mach49 today, we're onto something even bigger. We're onto an even bigger idea. The idea here, in the case of Mach49, is what lessons can we take from unicorn startups who are in every vertical market in the entire world and whose market capitalization is now in the trillions and trillions, and there are hundreds of unicorn startups. What lessons can we take from unicorn startups? What lessons can we take from world-class venture capitalists, many of whom are just a few miles away from here on Sand Hill Road? How can we abstract those lessons, and how can we reapply them in new places? to help huge organizations to prosper.
I love that, and it looks like you guys are eliminating the line between the digital and physical world. And what I mean by that is at the IDEO, when you were there, it was about design thinking and more like a design perspective.
Yes.
When I come to Mach49, you actually hook all those principles and match them, whether by history matching and whatnot, to real startups that are doing real work. And by combining these, you kind of have a dynamic or triangulation of ideas and applications where actually you see the idea and how it's delivering, and then you readjust as you go on. I love that. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course, along the way if I deviate. But first question here is, where did you grow up, and how was the environment you grew up that shaped your character at maybe early age?
Sure. I had a very comfortable childhood with two wonderful parents. Both of them were high school humanities teachers. My father was an English teacher who served in World War II, actually. And then his guidance counselor, upon leaving, told him that he had an aptitude for teaching. He went to USC, which is the University of Southern California. My mom, who had a pretty tough life, she was an orphan, actually, put herself through UCLA. So I grew up in West Los Angeles, which is about 350 miles south of where we are here in Palo Alto. Have an older sister, and I would say, everybody's childhood has ups and downs for sure. If there's one thing I really appreciate about my parents, it's that they really encouraged me in every direction of interest that I had. I loved science and technology from the time I was a kid. They didn't know a thing about science and technology. They couldn't tutor me in math or anything like that. But they really encouraged me in that direction. They took me to science museums when I was a little kid and things like that. And it makes such a huge difference to be encouraged and to get positive regard from your parents from very early on about what you're interested in and what you're excited about.
That's amazing. We will never forget how people make us feel. And it looks like your parents made you feel loved and comfortable, in that they didn't understand what you did, but they took you to places where you enjoyed seeing life sciences. And this is the importance of taking our kids to museums or anything got to do with their interest.
Yes.
At some point in history in the MENA region and other places, and maybe even the U.S., sometimes parents choose majors for their kids and saying, you need to be a lawyer or a doctor. And in your words, what was the chasms or challenges or opportunities during the primary, intermediate, or high school in terms of joining a club or your parents putting you in a course that actually was a building block of your work today?
I think some of the most important learning experiences I had as a kid were getting knocked around. And it continues to worry me that you've got kids often sometimes referred to as snowflakes today, who have really been coddled and prevented from having any sort of failure. Everybody's a prize winner, right? There were times when I got into scraps in the schoolyard and nobody was around to help me, and I came home with a bloody nose, right? There were times when when I fought with my friends and we had a lousy time. Nobody enjoys those things, but you learn a certain resilience, right? You learn a certain toughness, because what you want to avoid, I think, is children that are brittle, children that snap and can't, and can't return to a position of health after they've been set back by something.
That's amazing. I have a similar story to this. Is when I read a book. It's called The Hard Thing About Hard Things for what's his name? Not Mark Anderson, the other guy, Ben Horowitz.
Yeah, Ben Horowitz. Sure,
and he talks about a similar story. When he grew up, he remembers, getting in the bike and going beyond the limits that his parents set to other neighborhoods.
Yeah.
It was those little things that actually toughened him up and make him look into, outside a comfort zone per se. During the educational institutions, how was education at your time? Did you think it was preparing you for what has to become your first job in the workforce, or you thought the activities was good enough because you were in LA and it prepared you to be excelling. And I'm trying to compare this because some countries want to understand what makes Silicon Valley, and you are one of the leaders of Silicon Valley in terms of design thinking and being a professor and doing classes at Stanford. So I'm trying to just find things that maybe we cannot read somewhere, or we cannot in your lens.
Yeah. Like many people growing up, you're 12, you're 14, you sort of assume that people who excel at school will also excel in their careers later on. Without ever thinking about it consciously, I kind of made that assumption. And what I failed to understand, I had a friend who was an absolute top student in our high school. He went off to Stanford and got top marks at Stanford. Went to graduate school. He's never really gotten ahead in his career. And something I failed to understand is that certainly when I went to school, this is less true now, but when I went to school, everything was defined. Your assignments were well defined. You knew exactly what you needed to do when you had to do it. School did very little to prepare people for the ambiguity and to take the initiative that is such a fundamental part of the working world today. School prepares us to do well-defined activities, but if an activity is defined, that job is going to disappear to generative AI. You and I both know that, Ahmed.
Yes.
So the exposure we did have to ambiguity when I was growing up, the English teacher who has you read this hard-to-understand Russian novel and says, what is the author telling you? Okay? Those lessons were more important than I ever imagined, right? The idea of thinking critically, thinking logically, literary analysis, understanding subtext, right? At the time, I was just doing them because that's what the instructor told me to do. I now realize how valuable those things were. It concerns me that in many parts of the world, school curriculums are still multiple choice. They're still heavily fact-based. They're still about memorization and regurgitation of facts, and that is not preparing kids for the requirements of the 21st century.
Well said. I remember an experience in the MENA region. One of the universities were considered to be the hardest university in the region. And it was so because it was theory. And a lot of U.S. universities, people say they are not, I want to say the right word, they are not very hard in terms of that part.
Yes.
And because there's ambiguity in the space and allowing students to be more creative. And I love how we can measure schools by the research, but a big part of it is enabling students to explore the unknown and maybe come up with something imaginary that will add value in certain space. Great. Transitioning to college life.
Yes.
How did you choose electrical engineering, and how was that transition, and why did you choose University of California, Berkeley?
I was one of the lucky few. Most of my friends had no idea what they were going to major in. I was one of the lucky few who had really enjoyed studying physics in high school. And it's one of these things, it's hard to explain why you like something. The best I can tell you is I love learning about the physical principles that govern so much of the world around us. How is the light traveling from this light bulb onto our faces, right? How is how are the electrons flowing through the circuits inside the camera that's recording us right now? So I started as an engineering physics major, and you need to have a focus. And I chose electrical engineering just because I found it fascinating. It was something that I just loved. Growing up, I had tinkered with ham radios. I had tinkered with electronic build-it kits. I had always enjoyed the math and the physics that are so foundational to the study of electrical engineering. So it was a pretty natural direction for me.
Amazing. I took a class of electrical engineering, and I know it's not for me. I could not grasp the unseen, untangible. It was enjoyable, but I did not just grasp it.
And Ahmed, that's absolutely fine. And engineering wasn't for you. What's a real shame, and anyone who's an engineer has seen this, is up to a third of the people in my engineering curriculum were studying engineering because their parents had essentially
Yes.
dictated to them that that's what they were going to do. And that's a real shame. Maybe things worked out well by chance. The kids had an aptitude and interest in engineering. Their parents recommended it, and everything worked out. But I saw some very unhappy kids in engineering. It was meaningless to them. And if something is meaningless, you don't absorb it. You don't learn a thing. You forget it as soon as you've crammed for the final. What kind of an education is that? That's a real shame.
This is a very good point.
Yeah.
And after that class, by the way, I shifted. I'm like,
Yeah.
So correcting
Good
course.
for you.
Yeah.
Good for you for having the gumption to shift.
Yeah.
A lot of kids don't. A lot of kids stick with it out of a misplaced fidelity to their parents' wishes.
Yeah, and mentorship, this is why mentorship plays a big role in academia and in the workforce. Now, when we talk about you doing your undergrad, does stand out any experience in terms of academic program abroad, a research opportunity, and internship? We want to talk about challenges, but opportunities as well, to see how these 4 years have shaped your character to move into the master's program.
Yes. Happy to tell you about the whole path from undergrad to graduate work and my master's work in robotics.
That would be great, yeah.
The overall point I want to make is this. People love to position their life stories as if it was very calculated and deliberate. It never is. Don't believe it. So for me, as for anyone else, what I like to believe that the story of my career, as well as the story of my academic life, is one of chance events benefiting a prepared mind, right? So something I would urge any engineering student to do is to get technical summer jobs, because there's so much theory to be learned. You're busy studying, Maxwell's equations for electricity and magnetism, stuff you didn't like, right? And you're busy studying circuit theory and thermodynamics. You need practical experience to balance all that, to balance all that theory. And even the labs don't give you as much practical experience as you would like. The engineering labs are all pretty predefined. One of the best experiences I had 2 really meaningful experiences. You don't know that they're meaningful until afterwards.
Yeah.
The first meaningful experience I had was I loved space science. I love the idea of working in space science. I thought at the time, this was years ago, that we would be making a Mars shot pretty early, that NASA would be making a Mars shot. That's what I wanted to do for a living. I was so thrilled after my 3rd year at university, after my junior year, when I got a job at the UC Berkeley Space Sciences Institute. It's a beautiful place in the hills up above the campus. I was positive it was my dream job. I'm so glad I took the job because I learned something very important. Wasn't for me at all. The time scale of these programs was 15 years before, in this case, I was working for a thing called the Keck Observatory, which is now it's now been delivered. It's a telescope on an extinct volcano in Hawaii. The fact is, the time scale of these things, the 15-year time scale, for me was completely de-energizing. It was so hard for me to get motivated. I tremendously admire to this day the founders of that program. For example, a man named Jerry Nelson, who had the energy and the fire in his belly to be busy and fully committed every single day for this target that was 15 years out. It wasn't for me. I just found myself getting sleepy and de-energized and unmotivated. And I discovered that while I love these lofty goals, building space telescopes, building landers that are going to explore Mars, a shorter time frame for electromechanical systems was much more practical for me. I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't taken the job. I would have been a graduate applying for jobs at NASA. So one of the people who I worked with at the Space Sciences Lab actually recommended a program called Dynamics and Controls, which is what I did for my master's degree, which was all about smaller electromechanical systems with embedded controllers. That's what allowed me to start to do work on scientific instruments, on medical instruments and devices, on office and consumer electronics. Those are more like a 2 to 4 year turn in terms of development cycle.
Yes.
That's energizing, right? The team is fired up because the thing is going to get onto the market soon.
Amazing, well put. I always found there's a new major coming out. I don't know how old it is, called electromechanical engineering.
Yes.
Which combines
Yes.
both. So usually the path people take is they take maybe mechanical, then
Yeah.
electrical. You started electrical.
Yes.
Then you went to something that you had to take, but turns out it's not only mechanical, it's actually the robotics part in it.
Yes, yes.
Tell us in the masters, maybe, is that the second story you wanted to mention. So in the masters, how it is different.
Yes.
And how was your choice based on that? And maybe factoring back, looking at it, since you make decisions, you don't know they're right or wrong. How was that experience in terms of sometimes you need to live through the experience to learn, and it's okay to get an internship and you don't like it because that's one wrong answer out of the way, and the options you have in the table maybe have a higher probability of picking the right thing.
Yeah. So two things. First is, as you pointed out, my experience in my summer job taught me that the direction I thought I was interested in was the wrong thing. I made a mistake. I got way up in my head about it. I got very worried about it. I thought, what am I doing? I'm studying this field and yet I don't enjoy the work at all. I should have just said to myself, look, this isn't for me. There are many other possible directions. But at the time, that kind of information was just less accessible, pre-internet. Now, the graduate program at Berkeley is accelerated. If you have an undergrad degree in engineering, it's a fast, accelerated one-year master's. That changed everything. I didn't have the vocabulary or the insight at the time, but what I now realize is, at least to me, and I think for many people, a field that is interdisciplinary, that is a sort of mashup of two or more different things, is a really remarkable opportunity to take advantage of in your academic career. So mechatronics, it wasn't called that at the time, but it was control of electromechanical systems.
Yeah.
Mechatronics, by its nature, included software, firmware, electronics, and mechanicals. And you had to have a working knowledge of all of those things. My advisor demanded that all of us learn C language coding, which was the hot program at the time for machine control, as well as assembly language programming and machine language coding, just because he knew that 4 decades ago, he knew that microprocessors would be ubiquitous in all electromechanical systems, and he wanted every one of his graduates to get familiar with it. So I think, in retrospect, 2 lessons here would be: take maximum advantage in your academic career of interdisciplinary work, where you get to combine 2 different academic schools of thought, and also hitch your wagon to the star, particularly if you're in graduate school, of a very, very successful advisor.
Absolutely. I work in a startup now where the advisor who was the mentor for our CEO while he was doing the PhD is a great support. And this is testament to all the advisors who put the extra mile, knowing the hard work they do. They're not necessarily going to get paid for it, but it's the right thing to do, because the success of your students is a testament to your commitment to passing the baton to the next generation. And this is what this podcast is about. Now we're thinking about academia transitioning to the workspace.
Yes.
I'll give you the freedom to start at IDEO or the first job you got out of school, and how was that choice, and staying there, how was the experience, and maybe we'll go through some principles.
I mentioned earlier when we were in this conversation how supportive my parents were.
Yes.
My well-meaning parents, who grew up in Los Angeles, had all kinds of friends who worked in aerospace. At the time, Los Angeles was a center of military aerospace. Companies like Grumman, Northrop, Martin Marietta, and Hughes Aircraft were all down there. With all the best intentions, they asked some of their friends to show me around their offices as an indication of what I might be doing when I graduated. I thought it was the most horrible thing I'd ever seen. It was all men. It was a bunch of men in uncomfortable looking clothes, tight ties that looked as though they were choking them to death, pasty looking, unhealthy, smoking, and typing reports on typewriters. It was like a vision of hell. There was no way I could see myself doing that. And so, partly as a response to cubicle fright, At the time, everything was still in the newspaper. I saw an ad in the Daily Californian seeking engineers for 1-year contracts in Japan, and I thought, man, I'll do that before I go work at one of these big, boring, cube farm aerospace companies. I spent a very enjoyable and illuminating year in Japan, working for a consulting firm with high-tech companies that were seeking to expand globally into English-speaking areas and needed help with their English language presentations, primarily their technical English language presentations. It was a great contract, a sort of a transition. It also significantly people were paid very well. Teaching technical English in Japan in the 80s was you did well, and so I had money to spend about 7 months on the road, which again. Does it relate strictly to advance my technical career? Did I learn a technical skill? No, of course not. But in the spirit of someone having a holistic, broad-minded worldview,
Yes.
I'll tell you what, spending 7 months, especially, this was back in the 80s, things were tough then.
Yes.
Traveling through Southeast Asia, traveling through Nepal, spending 3 months in India, that was a life-changing experience. My first job was with a startup because my intuition was I wanted to work for a company with the spirit of a large organization, but that was actually a smaller organization. And just amazingly, an opportunity came up. Hewlett-Packard was a much admired company all through the
Yes.
80s. All engineers wanted to work there. Hewlett-Packard often spun out its ideas from HP Labs. And so a small startup that had been spun out of HP hired me because they needed somebody to design a robot arm that was very similar to the robots that I had worked with when I was in graduate school. So again, it was serendipity. I can't say I engineered this future for myself. 4 years later, the company was sold, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I'd gotten stock options, as engineers typically do, and all of a sudden, my mom was telling me, well, it's time for you to buy a house. And I was 28 years old. I had no idea what I was doing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
There is so much stuff we can talk about in this
Yeah.
short sentences.
Yeah.
I'll start with the Japan and then East Asia trip.
Yeah.
And it's something I was lucky I was exposed to. I lived in Ireland, I lived in Alaska,
Yeah.
and a few summer programs here and there. And to my knowledge, at that time, I had no idea what the effect of them was.
Yes.
But
Yes.
being connected to that part of the world mentally and seeing their culture is so
Yes.
enriching. I
Yes.
cannot put the value in words.
Yes. Yes.
And I appreciate you mentioning your journey and that because
Yeah.
it is monumental to opening certain neural paths that allows you to see things in a different angle and perspective.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
reckon the medical schools in the U.S. almost have the same approach in accepting doctors from different disciplines. So you
Yes.
can be a
Yes.
chemical engineer or an English major and become a
Absolutely.
doctor.
Absolutely.
And, at Mach49 today, you handle so much different aspects. You have an early exposure, and that early exposure allowed you to think differently from that moment on.
Yes.
And I love the fact that your first job was a startup too.
Yeah.
So from your early steps after college, you were in the startup world one way or another.
Yep. Yep.
Great. What was after that? So the second career, and you have the freedom to choose whatever.
Yeah. So, the startup was wonderful until it wasn't. And what happened was the purchase of the startup was purchased by a larger organization. It was a wonderful liquidity event. But what I discovered was I still had a place in the organization, but it wasn't right for me. I had clipped an article from Newsweek a couple of years before, Newsweek magazine, called "The New Wizards of Silicon Valley." It described a place called David Kelly Design, which, by the way, we can almost see. If you could walk through that building and down 3 blocks, you'd be at 151 University Avenue.
It's to the left before Apple?
It's
Apple Store.
It's to the right.
To the
It's
right,
at the
okay.
Yeah. It's right near Alma.
Okay, I know where that is, yeah.
It's at the intersection of High and University Avenue, a 4-story building. And I thought, gee, I'm very happy here with the startup, but if anything ever changes, I'm going to talk to these folks. So my whole life revolved around this area.
Wow.
I was living at the time with a bunch of roommates in a little house on High Street, about 5 blocks from here. I wandered over to this company, which was called David Kelly Design. It later became IDEO.
Yeah.
Dropped off my resume, and again, just serendipity, in part because this startup, Kevex, had been successful, and my designs had been shipped all over the world. That gave me the credibility to get a job at David Kelly Design.
Amazing. So the first time I saw you was a course in Stanford.
Yeah.
So I was in a month taking a great class. It was so illuminating, and I thought things couldn't get any better. And I take product market fit class, and you were one of the instructor, and I'm like, wow. In terms of every professor had their own expertise, application, and design, but they had theoretical part and they were advising startups. So what I liked was not only you give a point or a lecture, but you tie it to a practical meaning that allows students to, okay, I understand now what is the relationship between the theory and how application actually differs, and why do I have to try different things until the model works. And I'm jumping to this fact because I want to understand the relationship between d.school and Stanford, IDEO, because they're both great organizations. You have worked in both. Let's talk about IDEO, what they do, and how they developed, and then we'll talk about d.school.
Sure. So let's talk briefly about IDEO. It was an amazing ride at IDEO. So what happened? So Stanford had a wonderful major. A couple minutes ago, I said to you that interdisciplinary majors are often the most attractive ones. The product design major at Stanford is a combination of mechanical engineering, art, and business. That's a fascinating area. 3 or 4 friends from the product design program at Stanford, a man named David Kelly, a man named Dennis Boyle, Jim Yurchenko, Rickson's son, they banded together to create David Kelly Design, which later became IDEO, right? So IDEO was founded on the product design program at Stanford. Now, one of the key milestones in IDEO's development was IDEO took, what had been taught at the Stanford d.school and really accelerated it and made it more rigorous and went way beyond the material that was taught at the Stanford d.school. I'll tell you what, a lot of the reason that IDEO became a thought leader in design thinking is because highly qualified external people helped us articulate what we did. It's very interesting. So we were a much admired product design consultancy, right? We were doing product design. We're doing product engineering. We invited Business Week to come in and look at what we did. The author from Business Week, who's a professional writer and really good at summarizing what they saw, they came away with an article describing what we did that, frankly, was a better description of our methods and our tools than anything we had put together. We also had a lucky break when a TV news show called Nightline came to us and filmed a video about a creation of a shopping cart. So the reason I bring it up is partly from help with clients and needing to keep pace with clients, and with the help of external journalists, frankly, we developed the methods and the tools at IDEO around design thinking, and then effectively we gave those back to the d.school, which was endowed by Hasso Plattner, one of the founders of SAP. So the big idea was Stanford, through product design, gave IDEO so much. Now let's have IDEO give back to Stanford via the curriculum for the d.school.
I'm glad you mentioned the person with SAP who actually supported that school.
Yes.
I did actually visit that school last week.
Yes.
And I put in my mind few institutions in Stanford because I went to HAI for artificial intelligence and other institutions. And for the d.school, I loved the space because it was summer, but there was somebody working in a lab. But it was mostly empty, and there was like the fire station, there was an institute.
Yeah.
Looking at the space, I talked to a couple of students. It was very prevalent that the idea of d.school itself to me, I love the cross path of different disciplines. And if you tell me design, arts, and mechanics in the same place, that is to me a place where innovation, art collide, and beautiful products will come out.
Yes.
Now, you were in the heart of all of this.
We were.
And
We were.
and as a group, all of you were putting these thoughts together. But eventually, towards the end of maybe, how was you involved with the D.school, and what happened after? You know, it looks like you in parallel you were at the D.school and you were at the IDEO. How this experience created something that pushed you to the next event in your career?
Sure, sure. Some of us at IDEO were tapped by the CEO and chairman, David Kelly, to teach at the D.school. He asked me if I would be willing to teach a class, but you know how it goes, Ahmed? He wasn't really asking me. So my exposure to the D.school was fantastic. Along with a venture capitalist from Moore Davidale called John Fiber, we taught one of the classes. It was very well attended. It was called Innovation for Scientists and Engineers. It was a fascinating program, and it was a good example of how interdisciplinary design thinking has become and how broad the appeal of design thinking is. Many years ago, if you were a PhD student in the sciences with mature PhD research, your options were work for a national lab, work for the US government, work for a large corporate lab like Bell Labs or today Google X or somebody like that, be a postdoc. There is now an option for people getting PhDs in the hard sciences to become entrepreneurs. So we taught a class to people who had their thesis already well underway on advanced polymer coatings or on new strategies to create silicon chips or new biomarkers in healthcare, in pharma. We taught a class to help them understand how they could go about commercializing their PhD research in a startup. So it was a wonderful mashup of two things I really love: design thinking and innovation on one side and leading edge technology on the other.
Amazing. What is the name of the class, if you remember?
It was design thinking for scientists and engineers. And later we renamed it to innovation for scientists and engineers.
Is that only a course or a program, PhD program?
It was a course. It was just a one long evening a week exercise based course for people who were in PhD programs elsewhere at Stanford. So they were already getting their PhD in engineering or in physics or in
all
data
over
analytics,
campus.
all over campus. Everybody was invited. The condition was you had to have mature PhD research in one of the hard sciences, and you had to be interested in entrepreneurship as a path forward for the work you were doing.
I have never seen a program like the D.school where it attracts every single student from campus.
Everybody.
So medical doctors. I love it.
Yep. We had a medical doctor. We had a guy. I love this line. He said to me, I asked him, he wanted to meet with me for coffee and talk about his ideas, and I said, so tell me what you do. And he said, well, I'm a brain surgeon, but I'm at the D.school because I like being a brain surgeon, but I'd like to be an entrepreneur as well.
Wow, what an experience.
Yeah.
What an experience. This place is so electrifying. I've been here 2 months.
Yeah.
And I can't believe I'm leaving tomorrow.
Yeah.
And
we'll miss you. It's been fun to have you
Thank you. I appreciate it. You guys have made this journey absolutely enlightening. And I was talking to somebody in the hotel staff today, and I was talking about this. They're like, yeah, you miss your family. I was like, I miss them a lot, but I miss this place already because I know the value it has been delivered to me through this program.
Sure.
Now, moving to Mach49, there's so much in between. I want to give you the freedom to go from where we are in the last conversation. There is NASA, there is Cisco, there is Johns Hopkins, Berkeley Engineering, Phillips, so much. I'll give you the freedom to take us all the way to M49 as you see it in your eyes.
Sure. I left IDEO 10 years ago. It had been a fantastic ride, but it was time for me to do something on my own. I did several things. I joined another startup called Bebop, which had a successful exit to Google. And at that point, I had my own business, and I decided I'll continue to run my own business unless and until something really exciting comes along. And spoiler alert, that really exciting thing was Mach49, right? So here's what happened. I had my own business, which meant that from day to day, I was doing a combination of sitting on boards of directors, consulting directly with leadership, and also working on small programs with various clients, and that includes NASA, who is tremendously rewarding to work with. I worked with NASA, I worked with Google, I worked with SRI here in Menlo Park, and so on. I was also an angel investor. I'm a very lucky guy. I try to live every day with gratitude. IDEO, when I was there, was purchased, and we had phantom shares. My very first startup was purchased, and Bebop, the startup that I worked for, was purchased. I was of a mind where I felt that I had been a very lucky guy in my life. I wanted to give something back. And the other thing, you always ask yourself, what do you believe? Where are your convictions? In terms of giving something back to the world and helping people with upward social and economic mobility, everybody has their own opinion. I encourage civil discourse and all kinds of thoughts. I am a guy who believes that one of the most important paths for upward social and economic mobility is free trade, capitalism, and encouragement of entrepreneurship. And I wanted to give back to the world understanding how I could help build entrepreneurship and productive capital reforms all over the world.
Amazing. And this was through the company before jumping to Mach49, or with
this was what I was doing. This was my conviction before joining Mach49, and I was taking little steps towards this, right?
Amazing.
When I met the woman who is now the CEO of Mach49, Linda Yates, a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, introduced us and encouraged us to get coffee together, I thought to myself, this is a way to change the way the global business community goes about its day. This is a way to really, it's not about enriching ourselves, it's about enriching the world through the best elements of capital, movement of capital, through free trade, through capitalism, and through entrepreneurship.
Amazing. I sensed that when I walked to Mach49 with our colleagues, and everybody was really enjoying. Like, I didn't know what to expect, and I didn't know we're gonna have boards and all this activity. And it was a great surprise for someone who has so much experience, still enjoys teaching and adding value. And we want you to know every single one of us was thankful because you were hands-on, you taught us this, and you gave us this great book. And I remember, like everybody else, I love reading, but having that book meant so much, and thank you for the great experience. Now, coming to Mach49 and doing all this work, maybe a little bit, because a lot of our listeners don't know what Mach49 is. So what do you guys actually do?
Right. Mach49 really does three things. We work with the largest organizations in the world to help them understand how they can create, build, and launch new ventures from inside, how they can make external investments, not acquisitions, but investments in small privately held companies to advance their strategic initiatives, and more broadly, how they can use the methods and the tools of startup-style entrepreneurship across their entire organization in every division for projects, for programs to improve operating efficiency, across the board. And where appropriate, fourth, we knit that together with strategy work, actionable strategy that leads immediately to innovation and venture-driven growth. So broadly, we're all about helping large organizations all over the world with venture-driven growth.
Amazing. There's a lot of examples of successful projects you have implemented. I will put the links in the website and other stuff that people can educate themselves about Mach49. Before I ask the identity capital question, I want to see if I left something. You want to comment on something before I ask the last questions in the podcast.
The one thing I'll say is I think all of your listeners should be encouraged, Ahmed, by your intellectual curiosity and your breadth of interest and what is clearly a genuine passion and excitement that you have in what you do. It's great to see. You're not here talking to me because you're seeking to enrich yourself. You're here because you're excited about what's going on in Silicon Valley, and you want to communicate that excitement to other people. Well done.
Thank you. It means a lot coming from me. I really appreciate it. This place is, I was actually talking with a guy who I met 4 years ago, but I never met in person. I met virtually. And I was in a hotel. I wanted to meet him. I had a couple commitments. I was like, look, I have a ride from the hotel to here.
Yeah.
Let's talk. So
Yeah.
I jumped with him, and we were talking, and he talked about the bug. And I was like, yes, I got the bug in the startups, and I cannot stop. It's
Yeah.
So this
Yeah.
place is contagious with energy, and
Yes,
we're glad
yes,
to be here.
yes.
The identity capital question, it says, there's certain lessons in life not learned from the university or from reading books. Whether you take an adventure, you fail and you learn, or you learn from somebody's failure. If time goes back, and I know that's a tough question to just pick one, but what kind of lesson that you actually learned in that aspect you wish you learned earlier in your life or your career?
Oh, there's so many lessons I wish that I had learned. I wish that I had learned earlier. I think some of the lessons professionally that I wish I had learned is, first of all, it's very unhealthy to have rigidly defined functions and definitions. Everyone needs to have something that they're good at, right? You're a programmer, you're a manufacturing engineer, you're a CPA. You need a depth of expertise. But something that I wish I had understood earlier is it's incumbent on all of us, particularly at a time when, like we mentioned earlier, generative AI is going to change everything about the way we live and work and play. Picture the letter T, a capital T. If your area of deep skill is the vertical bar of the T, right? For example, you're a first-rate chip designer. The horizontal bar of the T is your empathy and understanding for other disciplines that are around you. And I think one of the most important things leaders can do in organizations is offer permission to dabble. You can't allow people to be dilettantes and just traipse from activity to activity to activity. You need an area of depth and expertise, right? But something I failed to understand in my first job, and I just wish I had known, is my feeling, for example, when I started with my first startup was, okay, the marketing people figure out the specifications and figure out what the customer's needs are, and then the engineers deliver it. And there's no connection between the two, because that's how business was run at the time. And I regret for so long, including in early days at David Kelly Design and in very early days of IDEO, I regret the walls between those disciplines. Couple other thoughts. I wish I had understood that taking in information, when you're trying to do something innovative, inspiration is as important as information. Sure, you need basic information, but you're trying to figure out how to build a better electronic medical record software platform. Look, speaking to people and getting conflicting information and struggling to interpret it and getting inspiration from that struggle with a like-minded team, that's every bit as important as just gathering information. And finally, I know it's a cliche, but whether you're talking about design thinking or agile development, both of these disciplines remind us of the importance of creating successively more sophisticated, iterative cycles of prototypes. I wish I had known earlier, just make something simple to test the basic principles that you're getting out with as early as possible, right? Don't start with a marketing requirements doc, build out a very detailed system, and then launch it only to discover it's not what people want.
Well said. The execution is definitely an art, and
Yeah.
you definitely
Yeah.
have an eye for an artist. Dave, I enjoyed this talk. This is absolutely enlightening and wonderful. Thank you for coming to the show. I appreciate
It's
it.
been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time. For our audience, this was Identity Capital from the heart of Silicon Valley. We want to thank the Multiverse by Code for providing the space for us to shoot this great episode. And I want to thank our guest for having the time to come here despite his busy schedule. From the heart of Silicon Valley again, this is Ahmed AlTammar. This was Identity Capital. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.